a black executive, exhausted from a week of high-stakes negotiations, boards a flight home, ready to finally rest. But the moment she steps into first class, everything changes. A flight attendant targets her without cause, questioning her right to the seat she paid for, humiliating her in front of other passengers. Moments later, a decision is made that sends shockwaves through the airline. And what happens next sparks a chain of events no one could have predicted. Stay with me, this is a story of resilience, justice, and the power of standing your ground. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if the story resonates with you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that matter. The airport hummed with a familiar rhythm, a cacophony of rolling luggage, murmured conversations, and the occasional chime of a distant announcement. Naomi Wallace, a woman whose very presence could silence a room, moved through the bustling terminal with practiced ease. Her stride was unhurried, her expression unreadable, her tailored navy suit fitting her like armor. At 58, Naomi had navigated enough boardrooms and hostile negotiations to recognize power dynamics at a glance. This was another stage, another audience. Boarding gate A6 was no different. Travelers jostled for position, a mixture of impatience and entitlement radiating off them like heat. Naomi noticed the subtle shift when she approached the gate, an instinctive recalibration from the attendants who seemed unsure whether to greet her with deference or skepticism. Her ticket, printed neatly in bold black letters. Read first class, seat 1A. It was not a privilege she flaunted, but one she had earned, brick by brick, through grit and intellect. And yet, Naomi knew her presence here was an unspoken challenge to some. The flight attendant at the gate, a young man with a thin veneer of professionalism, barely glanced at her as he waved her through. Naomi felt the silent assumption lodged in his indifference. "You're not supposed to be here." She ignored it, as she had ignored countless similar slights over the years. Inside the plane, the air seemed to thicken. The first-class cabin gleamed with muted luxury plush seats, polished wood accents, champagne glasses perched delicately on trays. Naomi placed her leather bag in the overhead compartment and slid into her seat by the window. She adjusted the gold cuff on her wrist, a subtle yet defiant reminder of her place in this world. The sunlight streaming through the window illuminated her smooth brown skin, her natural curls framing a face that wore both kindness and unyielding resolve. Around her, the murmur began, not loud, not accusatory, just a hum of curiosity laced with disbelief. A well-dressed man across the aisle glanced up from his tablet, his eyes flickering with recognition. Another passenger leaned toward her companion, whispering something that made them both glance in Naomi's direction. She had seen it all before. The questions left unspoken, the assumptions unchallenged. Naomi opened her leather-bound notebook, her pen gliding over the page. She wrote in measured strokes, crafting plans and ideas for the nonprofit project that had consumed her thoughts for weeks. The cabin seemed to retreat as she immersed herself in her work, a small act of defiance against the noise of judgment. Then came the first interruption. "Excuse me, ma'am," a voice said, smooth but tense. Naomi looked up to see Clara Spencer, the lead flight attendant, standing in the aisle. Clara's uniform was crisp, her blonde hair pulled into a severe bun, her smile carefully practiced. "May I see your ticket?" Naomi blinked, surprised but unruffled. "Of course," she replied, reaching into her bag and handing over the ticket. Clara studied it, her brows knitting together. Everything was in order, first class, seat 1A. Still, she hesitated. "Thank you," she said, returning the ticket with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Clara lingered for a moment, her gaze flickering over Naomi as though searching for something to justify her unease. Naomi met her eyes with a calm, steady gaze. She had spent decades perfecting this, responding to suspicion with poise, forcing others to confront their discomfort without a single word. Clara finally moved on, but the tension remained like an unspoken accusation. The first-class cabin settled back into its rhythm. But the moment had already rippled outward. Naomi noticed it in the way other passengers shifted in their seats. The way the attendant at the front whispered something to her colleague. Both of them casting furtive glances in Naomi's direction. It wasn't blatant. Not yet. But Naomi knew the undercurrent of prejudice when she felt it. It was the same unspoken doubt she had encountered in boardrooms, charity galas, in neighborhoods where she had been stopped by strangers asking, "Are you lost?" Her pen paused mid-sentence, her grip tightening just slightly. The second interruption came as she was reviewing her notes. Clara returned, this time with a different energy, less polite, more clipped. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but it seems there's been a mix-up with the seating chart. We'll need to move you to another seat." Naomi raised an eyebrow, her voice measured. "A mix-up?" "Yes," Clara said, avoiding eye contact. "It's a system error. We'll need to relocate you to the economy cabin temporarily while we sort it out." The words landed heavily. Around them, the murmur rose again, this time tinged with curiosity and discomfort. Naomi felt the weight of every gaze. The unspoken question, "Why her?" She set down her pen deliberately, her expression unchanged. "My ticket is valid. I've been assigned this seat for weeks. What's the problem?" Clara hesitated, her authority faltering under Naomi's calm insistence. It's temporary," she said, her voice wavering. "We need your cooperation." Naomi leaned back in her seat, her gaze piercing. "Are you sure this is a system error? Or is it something else?" The challenge hung in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. Clara stiffened, her composure cracking. "If you refuse, I'll have to involve security," she said, her tone sharpening. Naomi held her gaze for a moment longer, then exhaled softly. She stood, retrieving her bag from the overhead compartment. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as though reclaiming the dignity Clara had tried to strip from her. As Naomi walked past the rows of first-class passengers, she felt their eyes on her, some sympathetic, others avoiding her gaze entirely. The invisible line had been drawn, and no one dared cross it. When she reached the cramped economy cabin, Naomi slid into her new seat, her presence undiminished despite the humiliation. The young woman next to her glanced over, hesitant. "Why did they move you?" she asked quietly. Naomi smiled faintly, her voice low but firm. "Sometimes, people see what they expect to see," she said. "But expectations don't define me." Outside the window, the sun dipped lower on the horizon, its light spilling across the clouds in shades of gold and crimson. Inside the plane, the tension simmered, unspoken but undeniable. Naomi sat still, her mind already crafting the next step in a battle she hadn't asked for but one she was prepared to fight. For Naomi, this was not a defeat. It was a reminder that the line between progress and prejudice was as thin and as fragile as the clouds outside her window. Naomi Wallace sat in her new seat, the hum of the plane's engines filling the cramped economy cabin. The overhead lights flickered faintly, their harsh glow a stark contrast to the serene warmth of first class she had just left behind. Around her, passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their murmured conversations laced with speculation. Some glanced at Naomi with quiet curiosity, others with avoidance, a silent disapproval they didn't have the courage to voice. Naomi felt the weight of those glances but didn't let it show. Instead, she pulled her notebook from her bag, her fingers tracing the leather cover for a moment before flipping it open. Writing had always been her refuge, her way of carving clarity from chaos. Her pen moved with deliberate strokes, though her mind churned with questions. This wasn't the first time she had been made to feel out of place. But the sharpness of the moment stung all the same. She had worked too hard, climbed too high, to be treated as though she didn't belong. A voice broke through her thoughts. "Ma'am," a flight attendant said, leaning toward her. She was younger than Clara, her features soft, her tone apologetic. "Would you like a glass of water?" Naomi looked up, her expression calm but guarded. "Thank you," she said, her voice measured. The attendant nodded quickly, retreating with the awkwardness of someone caught in a situation they didn't understand but couldn't ignore. Nearby, a middle-aged man in a wrinkled shirt leaned toward Naomi, his voice low. "I saw what happened up there," he said. "That wasn't right." Naomi turned to him, her gaze steady. "No, it wasn't," she replied simply. The man shook his head, his discomfort palpable. "It's just, people don't always think. They don't realize what they're doing." Naomi smiled faintly, though her eyes remained cool. People realize more than they let on. The question is whether they care enough to stop. Back in the first-class cabin, Clara Spencer stood in the galley, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. Her usual confidence had begun to erode, replaced by a nagging unease she couldn't shake. Ethan, her younger colleague, approached her with a clipboard, his expression unreadable. "You really moved her to economy?" he asked, his voice low but pointed. Clara stiffened. "There was a seating error," she said, her tone defensive. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "A seating error," he repeated, the skepticism clear in his voice. "Her ticket was valid, wasn't it?" Clara turned away, busying herself with arranging glasses on a tray. "I don't owe you an explanation," she snapped. Ethan didn't press further, but his silence spoke volumes. Clara felt his judgment like a weight pressing down on her, compounding the tension already simmering in her chest. For years, she had prided herself on her professionalism, on her ability to manage any situation with poise. But this was different. The quiet resolve in Naomi's eyes, the murmurs from the passengers. Even the way Ethan looked at her now, it all made Clara feel exposed in a way she hadn't anticipated. In economy, Naomi continued writing, her pen tracing words that felt like armor against the indignity of the moment. She was deep in thought when the same young flight attendant returned, this time with a glass of water and an uneasy smile. "Here you go, ma'am," she said, setting the glass on Naomi's tray table. She hesitated, then added, "If there's anything else you need, please don't hesitate to ask." Naomi nodded, her tone gracious. "Thank you." The attendant lingered for a moment, as if wanting to say more, but the tension in the air held her back. She glanced around nervously before retreating, leaving Naomi alone with her thoughts once more. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, a subtle jolt that seemed to ripple through the cabin like an omen. Passengers stirred, fastening their seatbelts and exchanging uneasy glances. Naomi remained still, her grip on her pen steady, her gaze fixed out the window. She had weathered storms far greater than this, both in the air and on the ground. But as the turbulence subsided, the challenges began to stack. A man across the aisle spilled his drink, the contents splashing onto Naomi's bag. He muttered a half-hearted apology, his tone more annoyed than remorseful. Naomi cleaned the bag with measured calm, her silence disarming him. Another passenger, an older woman with tightly curled gray hair, leaned over as if to offer a word of comfort but stopped short. "You're very calm," she said instead, her voice tinged with both admiration and pity. "Most people would have said something." Naomi met her eyes with a faint smile. "Most people wouldn't have needed to," she said evenly, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Back in the galley, Clara was unraveling. She couldn't focus on her tasks, her mind looping back to Naomi's steady gaze, the murmur of discontent among the passengers, and the quiet disapproval in Ethan's eyes. She felt the walls closing in, her carefully constructed facade cracking under the weight of her actions. Ethan approached her again, his tone softer this time. "Clara," he said, "you know this isn't going to end well, for you, or for the airline." Clara glared at him, her frustration spilling over. "I don't need a lecture, Ethan," she snapped. "I made a call. It's done." Ethan shook his head, his disappointment clear. "No, Clara, it's not done. Not even close." Clara's hands trembled as she arranged the trays for the meal service. She wanted to believe she had made the right decision, that her authority as lead flight attendant was enough to justify what she had done. But deep down, she knew the truth, and the truth was starting to catch up with her. In the economy cabin, Naomi closed her notebook, her thoughts settling into a clear and unshakable focus. The challenges were mounting, yes, but Naomi knew something Clara did not. She was ready for them, because for Naomi, this wasn't just about one flight, one seat, or one person's bias. It was about something much larger, a fault line that ran through society itself. Subtle yet seismic, shaping lives in ways most people refused to acknowledge. And Naomi had spent her entire life learning how to navigate those fault lines. Now, as the plane hummed steadily toward its destination, Naomi prepared herself for the next challenge. Whatever it would be, she was ready. The air in the economy cabin was heavier now, the rhythmic hum of the engines unable to mask the growing tension. Naomi Wallace remained seated, her posture immaculate, her expression composed. Yet beneath the calm surface of her demeanor, a sharper focus brewed, a readiness for whatever came next. Around her, passengers murmured quietly, their voices carrying curiosity, confusion, and unease. The turbulence had passed, but the ripple effects lingered. Across the aisle, an older woman watched Naomi with a mixture of intrigue and discomfort. She leaned over, her voice low but insistent. "I've seen things like this before," she said. "They make it hard for people like us, no matter how far we've come." Naomi turned to her, her gaze steady. "They try," she replied softly, her tone firm but devoid of anger. "But trying doesn't mean succeeding." The woman nodded, her eyes clouded with memories she didn't share. "You remind me of my daughter," she said. "She never let them break her either." Naomi offered a faint smile, but her mind was elsewhere. She had long since stopped carrying the burden of proving her worth to those who underestimated her. But today's affront had reopened old wounds. She could feel the subtle pulse of indignation beneath her skin, not because of the insult itself, but because of what it represented, a pattern so old, so insidious, it had become woven into the fabric of everyday life. In the first-class galley, Clara Spencer struggled to regain control of her composure. Her hands moved mechanically, arranging cups and plates, but her mind raced. The murmurs among the passengers had grown louder, their discontent bleeding into her fragile sense of authority. She felt exposed, as if every glance in her direction was a silent condemnation. Ethan leaned against the counter, his arms crossed. "Clara," he said, his voice even, "you need to think this through." Clara shot him a sharp look. "Think what through? I handled it." Ethan shook his head, his expression a mixture of disbelief and pity. "You didn't handle it. You made it worse. And now everyone knows it." Clara's jaw tightened. "I did what I thought was right." "No," Ethan replied, his voice rising slightly. "You did what made you feel comfortable. There's a difference." The words struck a nerve, and for a moment, Clara faltered. She wanted to argue, to assert her authority, but the weight of Ethan's words hung heavy in the air. Deep down, she knew he was right. Back in economy, Naomi's phone vibrated in her lap. She picked it up discreetly, her sharp eyes scanning the message on the screen. Preparations underway. Contact initiated. She slid the phone back into her bag, her expression unreadable. Naomi knew the next steps were already in motion. What Clara and perhaps even the airline didn't realize was that this wasn't just about one incident. Naomi had spent years navigating these waters, understanding the intricate dance of power and prejudice. And she wasn't going to let this moment pass without consequence. The cabin lights dimmed as the flight crew began meal service. Clara, having returned to the first-class section, hesitated before addressing the passengers. Her voice, usually confident, wavered slightly as she explained the options for the evening's menu. A man in a tailored suit interrupted her, his tone sharp. Why did you move that woman to economy? Clara stiffened, her hands gripping the serving cart. There was a seating error, she said, her voice strained. Was there? The man pressed. Or did you just decide she didn't belong here? A murmur of agreement rippled through the cabin. Clara's face flushed, her carefully constructed authority crumbling. She tried to regain control, but the questions kept coming, each one chipping away at the walls she had built around herself. Meanwhile, Ethan observed from the galley, his expression grim. He knew Clara was unraveling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. In the economy cabin, a young man wearing headphones leaned over to Naomi. Saw what happened back there, he said. That was messed up. Naomi glanced at him, her face calm but firm. It was, she replied simply. You gonna do something about it? He asked, his tone laced with curiosity. Naomi allowed herself a small smile. I already am. The young man raised an eyebrow, intrigued but uncertain. Naomi's answer wasn't one he could fully grasp, but there was something in her tone, a quiet confidence that hinted at the depth of her resolve. As the meal service reached Naomi's row, the younger flight attendant from earlier returned, her hands trembling slightly as she set down Naomi's tray. Ma'am, she said softly, I just want to say I'm sorry for everything that's happened. Naomi met her eyes, her gaze piercing but not unkind. What are you sorry for? She asked. The attendant hesitated, her cheeks reddening. For how you were treated. It wasn't right. Naomi nodded, her expression thoughtful. Acknowledging that is a start, she said. But the real work comes next. The attendant looked uncertain, but she nodded before retreating. Naomi returned to her notebook, her pen moving with renewed purpose. She was no stranger to these battles. But this one felt different. It wasn't just about her, it was about the larger forces at play. The quiet but pervasive ways prejudice seeped into everyday life. By the time the plane began its descent, the tension on board was palpable. In first class, Clara stood near the galley, her hands trembling as she reviewed the final checks. Ethan approached her one last time, his voice low. You know this isn't over, right? He said. Clara didn't respond, her eyes fixed on the cabin door. She felt the weight of every decision she had made during the flight, the cracks in her authority widening with each passing moment. For years, she had operated on instinct, never questioning the biases that shaped her actions. But now, faced with the consequences, she couldn't ignore them any longer. In the economy cabin, Naomi fastened her seatbelt, her mind sharp and focused. The landing would mark the beginning, not the end. As the plane touched down and the engines roared to a halt, Naomi prepared herself for the next step. She knew the battle ahead would be long, but she also knew she was ready, because this wasn't just about reclaiming her seat. It was about dismantling the invisible structures that kept people like her in the margins. Even when they had fought their way to the center, the plane's wheels kissed the runway, and the cabin jolted lightly as the engines slowed their roar. Outside the window, Naomi Wallace watched the airport skyline come into focus, her gaze steady and unyielding. The hum of the engines had replaced the unease in the air. But beneath the surface, the tension lingered, like an ember waiting for a gust of wind. Around her, passengers began unbuckling their seatbelts, reaching for their bags, and murmuring about connections and delays. Naomi remained still, her hands resting on her notebook. This was the quiet before the real storm, the moment when everything would be set in motion. Across the aisle, the older woman who had spoken to Naomi earlier leaned closer. You handled that with grace, she said, her voice soft but full of admiration. Naomi glanced at her, a faint smile playing on her lips. Thank you, she said. But grace is only the beginning. The woman nodded knowingly, her eyes filled with the weight of a long life lived under the same shadow. They'll push back, she warned. They always do. Naomi's smile faded into a look of quiet resolve. I'm counting on it. As the plane taxied to the gate, Clara Spencer stood at the front of the first-class cabin, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. Her usual poise had crumbled, replaced by a raw nervous energy that made her movements jerky and uncoordinated. She felt the weight of every passenger's gaze, even those who weren't looking directly at her seemed to radiate judgment. Ethan stood nearby, watching her silently, his arms crossed. "You need to apologize," he said quietly. Clara shot him a glare, her voice sharp and defensive. "I was following protocol." Ethan tilted his head, his expression both skeptical and disappointed. "Protocol? You mean the one you made up on the spot?" Clara turned away, busying herself with folding napkins. But her hands trembled. She knew Ethan was right, but admitting it felt like stepping off a cliff. For years, she had relied on her instincts, her ability to command respect without question. Today, that authority had been challenged in a way she wasn't prepared for. As the plane came to a full stop and the seatbelt sign dinged off, Clara took a deep breath and prepared to face the passengers. She positioned herself at the front, her practiced smile firmly in place. But her nerves betrayed her. She knew Naomi Wallace would pass through here, and she dreaded the encounter. Naomi gathered her belongings with deliberate calm, her movements unhurried. Around her, passengers shuffled into the aisle, their chatter growing louder as they prepared to disembark. The younger flight attendant, who had shown Naomi kindness earlier, paused beside her. "Ms. Wallace," she said hesitantly, "is there anything I can do for you before you go?" Naomi looked up, her expression softening. "You've done enough," she said. "Thank you." The attendant nodded, a flicker of relief crossing her face before she moved on. Naomi stood and stepped into the aisle, her bag resting lightly on her shoulder. As she walked toward the front of the plane, the murmur of passengers behind her seemed to follow, a quiet hum of respect and curiosity. When she reached the first-class cabin, Clara stood waiting by the exit, her smile strained. "Thank you for flying with us, Ms. Wallace," she said, her voice tight. Naomi paused, her gaze locking onto Clara's. The silence between them was heavy, pregnant with unspoken words. For a moment, it seemed as though Naomi might speak, but instead, she offered a faint smile, more a warning than a gesture of goodwill, and continued past her. Clara exhaled sharply, her hands clenching at her sides. She felt the sting of that silence more deeply than any words Naomi could have said. Inside the bustling terminal, Naomi was met by a sharply dressed man holding a sleek tablet. "Ms. Wallace," he said, his tone crisp, "your car is ready, and the team has been briefed." Naomi nodded, her expression cool and composed. "Good," she said. "Let's proceed." As they walked through the terminal, the energy around Naomi seemed to shift. People turned their heads as she passed, some recognizing her, others simply sensing her presence. She carried herself with a dignity that demanded attention, her steps purposeful and unhurried. Behind her, Clara had also disembarked, her face pale as she clutched her phone. She had just received an email from the airline's operations team, summoning her to an immediate meeting. The words "formal complaint" and "senior management" leapt off the screen, their weight settling heavily in her chest. Ethan appeared at her side, his expression unreadable. "They're not going to let this slide," he said. Clara glared at him, her voice trembling. "I know that. Do you?" he asked, his tone sharper now. "Because this isn't just about you, Clara. This is about the airline, the passengers, and the fact that you let your bias dictate your actions." Clara opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, she turned and walked briskly toward the meeting room, her heart pounding. Naomi's car sped toward the airline's corporate headquarters, where a boardroom full of executives awaited her arrival. Inside the glass-walled meeting room, the atmosphere was tense. The CEO, William Hale, sat at the head of the table, his expression grim. Stacks of reports lay before him, each one detailing the incident on the flight. Naomi's name appeared repeatedly, alongside words like discrimination and unacceptable conduct. When Naomi entered the room, the executives rose to greet her, their movements stiff with formality. William extended a hand, his tone measured. "Ms. Wallace, thank you for meeting with us on such short notice." Naomi shook his hand, her expression cool. "I trust you understand the gravity of this situation," she said, her voice sharp but calm. William nodded, gesturing for her to sit. "We do," he said, "and I want to assure you that we are taking this matter very seriously." Naomi raised an eyebrow, her gaze piercing. Serious enough to address the systemic issues at play, or just serious enough to smooth this over? The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut. William cleared his throat, his voice faltering slightly. "We've already begun reviewing our training programs and protocols." "Words," Naomi interrupted, her tone icy. "What I want are actions, concrete changes, and accountability." The executives exchanged uneasy glances, but Naomi didn't back down. She had fought too long and too hard to let this moment slip through her fingers. This wasn't just about her, it was about the countless others who had been silenced, dismissed, or pushed aside. As the meeting progressed, Naomi laid out her expectations with precision and clarity. She demanded a full review of the airline's practices, mandatory bias training for all employees, and a public acknowledgement of their failures. William and his team listened, their expressions growing more somber with each passing minute. Meanwhile, back at the terminal, Clara sat in a small office, facing a panel of HR representatives. The questions came swiftly, each one peeling back the layers of her decisions until she was left with nothing but the raw truth. She had acted out of bias, and now she was paying the price. By the end of the day, Clara would leave the terminal with a suspension notice in hand, her career hanging by a thread. But for Naomi, the day was far from over. As she left the boardroom, her phone buzzed with messages from her team. The work had just begun, and Naomi was ready to see it through. Because in a world where the invisible lines of prejudice still shaped lives, someone had to draw a new line, a line of accountability, justice, and change. And Naomi Wallace was determined to be the one to draw it. The air inside the corporate headquarters felt electric. Each step Naomi Wallace took down its polished hallways echoing like a gavel striking a bench. The meeting with the airline's leadership had concluded. But the real work, the battle for something deeper, was only beginning. Naomi had left the conference room with promises in hand: public accountability, systemic reforms, and mandatory training to address biases. Yet she knew promises were only as strong as the resolve behind them. As she stepped into the crisp air outside, her driver was waiting by the car, the sleek black sedan gleaming under the afternoon sun. Naomi slid into the back seat, her mind already turning over the next steps. She opened her leather notebook, the pages filled with strategic notes written in her measured hand. "Where to, ma'am?" the driver asked. "Back to my office," Naomi replied, her tone calm but resolute. "And make it quick." The car pulled into traffic, the rhythm of the city outside a sharp contrast to the quiet intensity inside the vehicle. Naomi's phone buzzed with messages from her legal team, from her colleagues, from the media, each one a ripple from the confrontation on that flight. She scrolled through them with the precision of someone sorting through data, noting the threads that needed to be pulled and the ones that could be set aside for now. Meanwhile, back at the airline's terminal, Clara Spencer sat in a dimly lit room, the suspension notice still trembling in her hand. She had spent the better part of an hour staring at the words, as if willing them to disappear. The small office felt suffocating, its walls pressing in on her as the reality of her situation settled over her. Across from her, Ethan leaned against the doorframe, his expression unreadable. He had been watching her in silence, his usual sharp wit tempered by the weight of what had transpired. "You should have seen this coming," he said finally, his voice low but firm. Clara looked up at him, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "I was doing my job," she said, though the words sounded hollow even to her. "No, Clara," Ethan said, his tone sharpening. "You weren't. You were doing what made you feel safe. And now it's caught up with you." Clara wanted to argue, to defend herself, but the words stuck in her throat. She knew Ethan was right. She had acted out of an instinct she had never questioned, a deep, silent prejudice that had been part of her for so long she hadn't even recognized it for what it was. And now, like a fault line beneath the city, that instinct had ruptured, exposing the cracks in everything she had built. The next morning, the story broke. A major news outlet had gotten hold of the incident report, and by midday, headlines splashed across screens nationwide. "Prominent Black businesswoman faces bias on airline, demands accountability." The article detailed Naomi's experience with clinical precision, drawing on interviews with passengers who had witnessed the confrontation. Social media erupted. The hashtags #BiasInTheSky and #AccountabilityNow trending within hours. Naomi's office was a hive of activity. Her assistant, a sharp young woman named Janelle, fielded calls from reporters and allies alike. While Naomi reviewed drafts of her public statement, she refused to let the narrative slip away, knowing how quickly the media could reduce something profound to a spectacle. "This isn't just about me," Naomi said, her voice calm but firm. "This is about a culture that tolerates this kind of behavior, normalizes it. We need to shift the conversation." Janelle nodded, her fingers flying over her laptop keyboard. "We've got statements from civil rights groups, business leaders, and even a couple of politicians," she said. "They're all backing you." Naomi allowed herself a small nod of satisfaction. "Good, let's keep the pressure on." But not everyone was in agreement. Inside the airline's headquarters, a quieter but no less intense battle was brewing. William Hale, the CEO, had convened an emergency meeting with his senior team, the tension in the room as thick as fog. Some executives were pushing back against the reforms Naomi had demanded, arguing they were too drastic, too risky. "This could cost us millions in training and restructuring," one board member said, his tone clipped. "Not to mention the backlash from certain customers." William's gaze was steely as he replied, "And what's the cost if we don't? Our reputation is already hanging by a thread." Another executive leaned forward, her voice tinged with frustration. "It's one incident. Can't we just issue an apology and move on?" William slammed his hand on the table, the sharp sound cutting through the room. "This isn't one incident," he said. "It's a symptom of something much larger. And if we don't address it now, it'll keep happening, and next time, it'll be worse." The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. But William knew this wasn't the end of the resistance. Change, he had learned, never came without a fight. For Naomi, the fight wasn't just about corporate reform, it was about reaching the people who had been watching, listening, and waiting. That evening, she appeared on a nationally broadcast interview, her poise and clarity shining through the screen. "This isn't about revenge or personal vindication," Naomi said, her voice steady but passionate. "It's about creating a system where everyone is treated with dignity and respect, regardless of who they are or where they come from." The interviewer leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think the airline will follow through on their promises?" Naomi's smile was faint but pointed. "They don't have a choice," she said. "Not anymore." The interview resonated deeply with viewers, particularly older Black Americans who had lived through decades of similar indignities. Calls flooded into the station, many of them sharing their own stories of bias and discrimination. For some, Naomi's stand felt like a vindication of their own struggles. For others, it was a reminder of how far society still had to go. As the night wore on, Naomi returned to her quiet apartment, the weight of the day settling over her. She sat by the window, looking out at the city lights that stretched endlessly into the horizon. Her phone buzzed with messages of support, but she set it aside, needing a moment of stillness. Her thoughts turned to her late mother, a woman who had raised her with the strength to face moments like this. Naomi could almost hear her voice now, low and resolute. Dignity isn't given, baby, it's taken. And once you take it, don't ever let it go. Naomi closed her eyes, drawing strength from the memory. She knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. The headlines would fade, the attention would wane, and the resistance would dig its heels in. But Naomi had no intention of letting this fight end with her. She picked up her pen and notebook, her hand moving with deliberate strokes. For Naomi, this was more than a battle for justice, it was a blueprint for change. And she intended to see it through. The weeks following the flight had become a crucible, a test of endurance and conviction for Naomi Wallace. The media storm that erupted from her experience had grown into a movement, its tendrils reaching into places Naomi had not expected: homes, churches, offices, and community centers where her story stirred memories of injustice long endured and rarely acknowledged. But for every voice of support, there was resistance. There always was. Naomi sat in her office, her desk covered in papers and reports. Across from her, Janelle read out updates, her voice brisk but tinged with urgency. "We've got backlash from some corners," she said, scrolling through her tablet. "There are people calling this a manufactured controversy. They're claiming it was just a misunderstanding. Nothing more." Naomi leaned back in her chair, her face calm but her eyes sharp. "Nothing more?" she repeated, her voice low. "Is that what they call it now? Misunderstanding has become the tidy excuse for everything, hasn't it?" Janelle nodded, her expression grim. "They're trying to downplay it, make it seem like you overreacted." Naomi exhaled slowly, her fingers drumming on the desk. She had faced these tactics before: the dismissal, the minimization, the attempts to twist the narrative until the real issue was obscured. It was the same game, but the stakes were higher now. "Let them talk," Naomi said finally. "Our actions will speak louder." At the airline's headquarters, the atmosphere was anything but calm. William Hale sat in his corner office, the blinds drawn, the room dark except for the glow of his computer screen. He had spent hours poring over reports, each one more damning than the last. Passenger testimonials, social media backlash, calls from stakeholders, every piece pointed to the same conclusion. The airline had mishandled the situation, and the world was watching. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was Marcia, the head of public relations, her face pale and drawn. "William," she said, stepping inside. "We've got another problem." William gestured for her to continue. "Clara Spencer," Marcia said, her voice heavy. "She's hired a lawyer. They're threatening to sue the airline for wrongful termination, claiming she's being scapegoated." William's jaw tightened. "Of course she is," he muttered. "She doesn't want to take responsibility for her actions." Marcia hesitated. "It's not just about her actions anymore. They're saying we're using her to cover up systemic issues." William stood, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. "They're not wrong," he said quietly. "This isn't just about her. It's about the entire culture we've allowed to fester here." Marcia nodded, her gaze steady. "So, what do we do?" William looked out the window, his reflection faint against the glass. "We own it," he said, "and we fix it." Meanwhile, Clara's decision to push back against the airline had only added fuel to the fire. News outlets seized on the story, framing it as a battle between a disgraced flight attendant and a powerful corporation. But beneath the headlines, the real battle was being fought in living rooms, on social media, and in community meetings. People debated the deeper implications of what had happened on that flight, what it said about race, power, and who was truly welcome in spaces designed for comfort and privilege. Naomi watched the debates unfold from a distance, her resolve unwavering. She knew this wasn't just about her or Clara. It was about a society that still struggled to confront its own biases, its own unspoken hierarchies. And Naomi wasn't about to let the conversation fade into abstraction. 1 month after the incident, The airline held a press conference. The room was packed with reporters, their cameras trained on the stage where William Hale and Naomi Wallace sat side by side. William spoke first, his voice measured but firm. "We are here today to acknowledge our failures," he began. "The incident involving Ms. Wallace was unacceptable. It highlighted systemic issues within our company that we can no longer ignore." He paused, his eyes scanning the room. "But acknowledgement is only the first step. We have committed to implementing comprehensive reforms, including mandatory bias training for all employees, a complete overhaul of our customer service policies, and the establishment of an independent oversight committee." The reporters murmured, their pens and cameras working furiously. Naomi took the microphone next, her voice calm but commanding. "This isn't about one flight or one person," she said. "It's about the structures that allow moments like this to happen, over and over again, to people who don't have the platform or the resources to fight back." She glanced at William, then back at the audience. "The real test isn't the promises we make today. It's the actions we take tomorrow, and the day after that, and every day after. Change is a long road, and we're only at the beginning." The press conference marked a turning point, but the work was far from over. Over the next several months, the airline rolled out its reforms, with Naomi playing a key role in holding them accountable. She met with employees, shared her story in workshops, and pushed the company to go beyond surface-level changes. Clara, meanwhile, had settled into a quiet obscurity. Her lawsuit against the airline had failed, and she had retreated from the public eye. But the experience had left its mark. For the first time, she was forced to confront the biases she had carried with her. Biases she had never questioned until they had cost her everything. 1 year later, Naomi sat in her office, reviewing a final report from the airline's oversight committee. The numbers were promising. Incidents of passenger complaints had dropped significantly, and employee satisfaction had risen. But Naomi knew the fight wasn't over. It never was. She stood and walked to the window, the city sprawling before her. The road ahead was still long, still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she felt something close to hope. Because change, real change, was never about grand gestures or sweeping victories. It was about the quiet, steady work of reshaping a world that had been built to exclude, to dismiss, to divide. And if Naomi had learned anything, it was that the fight for justice was not a sprint but a lifetime. As the sun dipped below the horizon, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. The challenges she had faced, the battles she had fought, they were not just hers. They belonged to everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, who had ever been made to feel invisible. Naomi smiled faintly, her resolve unbroken. The horizon was still far away, but she was moving toward it, step by step, and she wasn't stopping now. The changes were evident, yet fragile. A year after the flight that had upended Naomi Wallace's world and forced an airline to confront its flaws, the landscape was shifting. Policies had been rewritten, training programs implemented, and oversight committees formed. On the surface, the progress seemed undeniable. Yet beneath it all, the shadows of resistance lingered. Naomi was no stranger to this paradox. For every step forward, there was a pushback, often subtle, sometimes glaring, as she sat at the head of a long conference table, surrounded by members of the airline's newly formed Diversity and Equity Council. She could feel the tension simmering beneath the polite conversation. The room was filled with corporate executives, community leaders, and employee representatives, people ostensibly united by a common goal. Yet Naomi had learned to read the fault lines, the unspoken divisions that ran through even the most well-intentioned spaces. "I believe the training modules are a good start," one executive said, his tone carefully measured. "But we need to ensure they don't feel too aggressive. We don't want to alienate anyone." Naomi arched an eyebrow, her voice calm but pointed. "Alienate who? Exactly?" The executive faltered, his words caught in his throat. Around the table, a few others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. It's not about alienation, Naomi continued, her tone sharpening. It's about accountability. If we're too afraid of making people uncomfortable, we'll never address the roots of the problem. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, but Naomi knew the resistance wasn't gone. It had merely shifted tactics, adopting a quieter, more insidious form. She had seen it before, the language of compromise, the calls for moderation, the insistence that change must be slow to be sustainable. But Naomi had no patience for slow. The meeting ended with promises of follow-up actions. But as Naomi left the conference room, her phone buzzed with an urgent message from Janelle. She read it quickly, her brow furrowing. Another incident, Janelle said when Naomi called her. This time on a flight from Chicago to Houston, a black woman was removed from first class after another passenger complained she was being too loud. Naomi's jaw tightened. Was she disruptive? Witnesses say no, Janelle replied. But the airline staff sided with the complaining passenger. She was moved to economy mid-flight. Naomi closed her eyes for a moment, the weight of it pressing down on her. Contact the oversight committee, she said. I want a full report by the end of the day. And reach out to the woman, let her know she has my support. Janelle hesitated. You know this is going to stir things up again, right? Naomi opened her eyes, her gaze steely. Good. Let it. As news of the incident spread, the airline found itself back in the spotlight. The reforms that had been celebrated only months ago were now being questioned, their effectiveness called into doubt. Naomi became the face of the controversy once again. Her name splashed across headlines and hashtags. But this time, the backlash was more personal. Online, trolls attacked her character, accusing her of being divisive, of seeking attention. Anonymous emails flooded her office, some laced with venomous hatred, others couched in patronizing tones, urging her to let it go. Naomi read each one, her resolve hardening with every word. She had spent her life confronting these shadows, and she refused to let them derail her now. Yet the attacks took their toll. Late one night, as the city hummed quietly outside her apartment, Naomi sat by the window, her phone buzzing incessantly with messages. She stared at it, the glow of the screen casting faint shadows across her face. For a moment, she considered turning it off, retreating from the noise. But then she thought of her mother, of the stories she had told Naomi as a child, stories of marches and sit-ins, of quiet bravery and unyielding hope. Her mother had faced fire hoses and snarling dogs, fists and taunts, all in the name of progress. And if she could endure that, Naomi thought, surely she could endure this. She picked up her phone and began typing a statement, her words steady and precise. When she finished, she read it back to herself, her voice firm. Progress is not a straight line. It began. It is a winding road, full of obstacles and setbacks. But the obstacles do not mean we stop. They mean we press forward, with greater resolve. The next day, Naomi attended a meeting with the airline's executive team. William Hale was there, his usual confidence tempered by a weariness that had become more pronounced in recent months. This latest incident is a problem, he said, his voice heavy. We're doing everything we can to address it, but it's starting to feel like we're playing whack-a-mole. For every issue we solve, another one pops up. Naomi leaned forward, her eyes locked on his. That's because the problem isn't isolated, she said. It's systemic, and systemic problems don't disappear overnight. William sighed, running a hand through his silver hair. I know that, but the board is getting restless. They want to see results, tangible results. Naomi's gaze didn't waver. Then show them results. Enforce the policies you've put in place. Hold people accountable. And stop treating every incident like it's an isolated anomaly. William met her gaze, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of Naomi's words hanging heavily in the air. That evening, Naomi attended a town hall meeting hosted by a local civil rights organization. The room was packed, the air buzzing with energy and frustration. People of all ages and backgrounds had come to share their stories, to voice their anger, to demand change. Naomi listened intently as one person after another spoke. An elderly man recounted being denied service at a diner in the 1960s. A young woman shared her experiences with microaggressions at work. A middle-aged father described the fear he felt every time his teenage son left the house. When it was Naomi's turn to speak, she stood at the podium, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I hear your pain," she said. "I feel it, and I want you to know that your stories matter. They are the heartbeat of this movement, the fuel that keeps it alive." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. Change is hard, it's slow, and it's messy, but it's also necessary, because if we don't fight for it, who will? The room erupted in applause, the energy palpable. For the first time in weeks, Naomi felt a flicker of hope, not because the fight was over, but because it wasn't hers alone. As Naomi left the town hall, she was approached by a young woman carrying a notebook. Her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "Ms. Wallace," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted to say thank you for everything you're doing." Naomi smiled, placing a hand on the woman's shoulder. "Thank you," she said, "but this isn't just about me. It's about all of us." The woman nodded, her eyes bright with determination. "I know, and I'm ready to help." Naomi watched her go, her heart swelling with a quiet pride. The road ahead was still long, still uncertain, but for the first time in a while, Naomi felt something stronger than hope. She felt the power of a movement, one that couldn't be silenced. No matter how hard the world tried, the shadows of resistance might never disappear entirely. But Naomi knew one thing for certain. As long as there were people willing to stand in the light, the shadows would never win. The crisp dawn brought with it a quiet clarity. Naomi Wallace stood at the window of her office, watching as the sun broke over the skyline. The weight of the past year rested heavily on her shoulders. Yet her resolve had only hardened. This was no longer about one flight, one incident, or even one airline. It was about dismantling the quiet, pervasive systems that had allowed such indignities to persist for generations. Her phone buzzed on the desk behind her. She turned and picked it up, the screen glowing with Janelle's name. "They've released the full investigation report," Janelle said without preamble. "The Oversight Committee found systemic failures across multiple departments. They're recommending immediate restructuring." Naomi closed her eyes briefly, her lips pressing into a thin line. It was what she had pushed for. Yet she knew this was only the beginning. "And Clara Spencer?" Naomi asked, her voice steady. "She's reached out," Janelle replied. "Through her lawyer. She wants to meet." Naomi's brow furrowed. Clara Spencer had become the face of the incident, a symbol of the biases Naomi had spent her life fighting against. A meeting with her felt both necessary and fraught with complexity. "Schedule it," Naomi said after a moment. "I'll hear what she has to say." The cafe where Naomi and Clara met was quiet, tucked away in a corner of the city far from prying eyes. Clara arrived first, her posture stiff, her expression a mix of nervousness and defiance. When Naomi entered, Clara stood awkwardly, her hands fidgeting at her sides. "Ms. Wallace," she said, her voice faltering slightly. Naomi nodded politely as she sat across from Clara. "Thank you for coming," she said, her tone measured but firm. For a moment, the two women sat in silence, the unspoken tension between them thickening the air. Finally, Clara spoke. "I know I can't undo what happened," she said, her voice low, "but I've had a lot of time to think about it, about what I did, and why." Naomi leaned forward slightly, her gaze piercing. "And what have you realized?" Clara hesitated, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "I didn't see it at the time," she admitted, "but I acted out of fear. out of an assumption I didn't even know I had. Her voice trembled, but she pressed on. I grew up hearing things, small things, subtle things that shaped the way I saw the world. And I never questioned them. Not until now. Naomi regarded her silently, her expression unreadable. Clara's words rang true, but they also felt incomplete, as if she were still grappling with the full weight of her actions. I'm sorry, Clara said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Not just for what I did to you, but for the way I've contributed to something bigger. Something that hurts people every day. Naomi sat back, her gaze softening slightly. Acknowledgement is a start, she said. But what matters is what you do next. Clara nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. I want to do better, she said. I just don't know where to begin. Naomi's voice was firm but kind. Begin by listening, by challenging the things you've always taken for granted, and by understanding that this isn't a moment, it's a lifetime of work. In the weeks that followed, Naomi shifted her focus to a larger goal, organizing a national summit on systemic bias and equity in the workplace. It would bring together leaders from industries far beyond the airline sector, creating a space for uncomfortable truths to be confronted and real solutions to be developed. The summit was held in a sprawling conference center, its grand halls filled with people from across the country. Naomi stood at the podium, her presence commanding yet approachable. The room fell silent as she began to speak. We gather here today not to assign blame, but to take responsibility, she said, her voice steady. Responsibility for the systems we've built, the biases we've ignored, and the harm we've allowed to persist. She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. For too long, we've told ourselves that change is slow, that progress is incremental. But what if it doesn't have to be? What if we chose to act boldly, to confront the uncomfortable, to demand more of ourselves and each other? The room erupted in applause, the energy electric. Naomi continued, outlining actionable steps for reform, drawing on her own experiences and the lessons learned from the past year. She didn't just speak about problems, she offered solutions, practical and transformative. By the end of the summit, the attendees left not with easy answers, but with a renewed sense of purpose. And for Naomi, that was enough. Months later, Naomi sat on a bench in a quiet park, her notebook open in her lap. The world had continued to turn, as it always did, but the ripples from her actions were still spreading. The airline had followed through on its promises, implementing the reforms she had demanded. Other companies had begun to follow suit, inspired by her relentless advocacy. But Naomi knew the work was far from over. She had no illusions about the depth of the challenges that remained, nor about the persistence of the forces she was fighting against. Yet she also knew that every step forward, no matter how small, mattered. As she wrote, a young girl ran past her, laughing as her mother chased her through the park. Naomi watched them for a moment, a faint smile tugging at her lips. The girl reminded her of herself, bright, bold, unafraid. It was for her, and for countless others like her, that Naomi fought, because the fight for justice wasn't just about the present. It was about building a future where no one had to question their worth, their place, their right to exist with dignity. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Naomi closed her notebook and stood, her resolve as strong as ever. The path ahead was long, the shadows still lingering, but Naomi Wallace would not stop walking. Not now, not ever.